Hi, everyone. Welcome to Always Learning. I'm Laraine McKinnon. I'm a talent and culture strategist at M-Train. And our guest today is Janet Miller-Evans. Janet is the founder and CEO of Entevos, a consulting company focused on emotional intelligence, trust, leadership, and team engagement. Welcome, Janet.
Hi, thank you. It's good to be here.
Hey, we've been looking forward to having this conversation about reinventing the workplace, examining bias, racism, and microaggressions. And Janet and I, as friends, have been able to have lots of conversations on this really important topic. And as we were preparing for today, we're prepared to share some research on Blacks in corporate America and other observations from Janet's expertise in emotional intelligence. But we could not start without addressing and recognizing the really tragic incident with Ahmaud Arbery. He's a young Black man who was out jogging and was targeted and fatally shot in what is very clearly now a racial incident. We have been able to see the video, which was just shared with the public last week, and it's affecting all of us in terms of what we saw, what we understand to be the more systemic racism, and emotionally how we're managing, and also just recognizing that we are in the time of coronavirus. We are all under extra stress and anxiety. The Latinx community and the Black community are bearing the brunt of the illness, and the Black community is bearing the brunt of the deaths. And so we didn't want to start a conversation about racism and bias without recognizing the time and place that we're in, and also recognizing that Janet and her expertise around emotional intelligence is part of how we can cope and sort of share more ideas about how we can manage our emotions and learn to communicate and learn to resolve some of the issues here. So Janet, thank you so much for being with us today. Really glad to have you as a partner in this conversation.
Well, Laraine, thank you very much. And thanks to M-Train for allowing me also to share, and the thoughtfulness that you had to bring up the Ahmaud and have us at least pay some silent respect in our way for Ahmaud and his family. How we're getting through this it's very challenging. At a time when there's a crisis with the pandemic, at a time, like you said, when there's so many deaths in the Black community, to have this kind of heinous crime committed is very, very disturbing. It brings up so many emotions for all of us, but as you can imagine, even more so for the Black community in terms of how do we navigate through this? How do we find trust with others when there's so much mistrust that continues to come to the forefront when it comes to race? So again, thank you for allowing us to acknowledge that this is real in the community. And because it's real in the community, it's going to be real in the workplace.
Yeah, we're all home, working from home if we're lucky enough to be able to do so. Almost means that we don't transition between home and work, that we bring our emotions that come from our home life right into work. And it's always hard to compartmentalize, and I think it's even more difficult now. It also really strikes me that this is exactly the time when we want to be with our friends, with our family, with our community, to give each other a hug, and we can't. So how do we think about managing and coping with our emotions from afar?
Well, one of the things that we have to do and we can do is recognize we are in an emotional state and determine what emotion are we really experiencing here, and being very clear about that. And one of the things that would help is in the workplace, as you just did, to acknowledge it, that this is serious. It affects the Black community. It adds and it complicates and compounds the emotions that we are feeling. And when we hear these activities, and it comes to us like a scab being ripped off of a wound, and the pain begins all over again. And that causes so many emotions of fear, of anger, anxiety, mistrust. It's very complicated. And the one thing that makes it even more complicated is the word race. The word race has almost become taboo or negative when it is really the reality of what we're dealing with. And emotions can help all in understanding our emotions and becoming more in tune with our emotions and acknowledging them, naming them, and then finding ways to regulate that can give us positive outcomes is what we all can do, and we can work together in doing that. There was a gentleman, and I just saw this last night, that was on LinkedIn, and his name is Glenn Newman Jr., and he posted, what would his diversity and inclusion partners around the country do to help it with Black employees in the workplace manage through this? And I said that the next question would be, what are executives, managers, leaders of teams going to do to help the Black community navigate through this? And the first step is to do just as we've done today, to acknowledge this is real. This is a crisis, just like coronavirus, that we have to address.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really struck at the beauty of the run, the 2.23 miles in honor of Ahmaud. It felt like something that was really meaningful. If I'm not mistaken, it's because that was the day on which he was killed, February 23rd.
Correct, February 23rd.
Yeah, and I know when I had mentioned to you that we should really talk about this today, that you had sent back your pictures of your run, so you participated in his honor as well. Tell us a little bit about that, and why doing something like that is meaningful for the broader community, and maybe how we can bring it into the workplace.
It was very heartwarming and also in a way healing that I was doing my part, that I was representing a part of a community that's in amplified crisis. And so that's why it was so important. And I know that there were thousands of people who ran all around the country. And what we're saying is the ever-present crisis of racism is something that is also needing to be addressed. And we know that it's not going to be addressed overnight, that the solutions aren't magical, but the conversation needs to be had. And we're talking about people of color and putting all of the numbers together as if we're mixing them up in a cake and saying, voila, it's done. That's really not realistic. It's not what really needs to happen. Just as we came together and we said through this pandemic that we're going to work together, we're going to start in place together, we're going to reach out to each other, we're going to have those discussions, we're going to talk about emotions before we start our meetings, we're going to have meditations. I'm not suggesting that those links will always need to happen as we talk about racism, but I am suggesting that we do need to have the continuous dialogue about race individually and to address those needs individually. Because just as the variety of cakes need different ingredients to make them come out the right way, so do addressing the issues of not only race, but gender, sexual orientation, all of the underrepresented groups. They need to be addressed in their own way. And I think that's so important. And that's what's been called out for both Corona and for Ahmaud, that it affects different races in different ways. And it's real and it needs to be addressed. And companies can help with that by getting their executives, starting with the executives, the leaders of teams, training, ways to understand their own emotions, because their stories are real. And what we found is when people are able to share their stories, no matter what they are, they find a commonality and a way of being able to relate to each other. So prior to having that discussion on race, I strongly recommend that any organization that wants to really deal with the real issues that are there, that they help their employees deal with their emotions, their own biases, all of the things that affect the outcome, which comes to race at that point, or implicit bias, which is having a negative effect economically, psychologically, physiologically on certain groups. So it's really important now that we really talk about that and not let that be hidden. Because again, Laraine, and I'll stop with this one. When leaders look at it and they look at their teams, everyone has experienced some crisis, some feeling of trauma during this time. But it's real important that we, again, look at those groups that are having additional struggles based on the systemic policies that have been put in place that create and, again, amplify the crisis that these particular groups are feeling. Yeah, so thank you for allowing me to share that.
Yeah. I think you've made just now and in conversations we've had a couple of really strong points that I want to make sure that I echo and advocate. Number one, you had said, we've all had a shared experience, but our experience has not been the same. Mm-hmm. And another point that you've made is take advantage of this time of understanding how unusual this time is, particularly in organizations where senior leaders may have lacked emotional intelligence. We do some measurement in our training courses on social intelligence, social awareness, and skills. We can pretty clearly see that there are organizations that lack a lot of that social intelligence. It is such a unique time now. It's the perfect time to be taking emotional intelligence training. Because everybody has been affected, that emotions are running high, and you're an expert on emotions. Being overwhelmed, you've taught, is different than being anxious, which is different than being upset or angry or having fear. And the more that we can help people understand their emotions, and also, as you've explained, tie it back to the individual, and in many cases, the executive leader, who hasn't had to deal with so many of the aspects of what's really challenging for people, and helping them understand the range of emotions that others might have could be incredibly impactful at this very point in time. So take it from there. So I wanted to make sure that we echoed what you've shared, but what would someone do if they were looking to do that type of emotional intelligence training?
One, again, in the emotional intelligence training, what you'll learn is to identify, name the emotion. A lot of people struggle with naming their emotion. You'll say, how do you feel? And they'll say, good. Digging a little deeper, there are over 20,000 words for emotions. And you can find a word for everything that you're feeling. And if you take a little time to dig a little deeper, I've seen so many ahas with that. Then once you recognize, we name the emotion, then think about what are the choices, what are the consequential thinking, what are the serious decisions that you can make with options that will provide a better outcome for all involved. And then learning to regulate your emotions. We all have emotions. We all have biases. And I mentioned that there's so many different types of biases. There's consistency bias. There's unconscious bias. There's a normalcy bias. And when you think about normalcy bias, that term, I did a session on that a couple of weeks ago. And that term means that looking at a disaster but feeling like it won't touch you. And therefore, you don't make any preparations. You do nothing until you see someone else doing something, or you don't, and it doesn't lead to a positive outcome, or there's a percentage who will take action. Well, if you think about it, Blacks have been living with normalcy bias since birth. And what I mean by that is people in power or people who are racist don't see a disaster. and they don't feel that there will be any negative consequences to them with the disaster because they either don't believe it or they don't accept it. But actually, racism is critical, and it's a disaster for those who are victims of it. So when we look at it that way, and we look at it as it's a bias, so we want to help with emotional intelligence. We want to help the leaders as well as the employees call out their own biases so that they can then help with the solutions for them. Because emotional intelligence is a way to help people recognize that what their emotions are, and it's calling things up for them without calling them out. Because again, when we move into a mode of attacking, when we move into a mode when we cannot have this dialogue that you and I are having, then of course we've all seen the results of that, which is nothing, no outcome. People either going away even more, having more of the unproductive actions than they did before. And I want to stress that too. Emotions are data. They're all real. They all give you information. Fear. If you're afraid of something that's telling you danger, beware. Perhaps you need to look at other alternatives. Sadness. Sadness says you may need to go within and take care of yourself for a few minutes. So there are no good or bad emotions. It's just data. What's good or bad can be the outcomes or the actions that people take regarding their around their emotions. So the emotional intelligence training is not for one set versus another set. It's for all of us because emotions, it has been scientifically proven, or research has shown, emotions drive action. And so if we look at the whole subject of bias, bias drives racism, and racism drives negative actions and behaviors. So that's why it's very important that we address this without calling people out. And again, it won't happen overnight. There's no magic bullet. There's so many different underlying causes. But if we collectively, just as we're collectively fighting the crisis of coronavirus, fighting the crisis or the disaster of racism and its effects on communities in our country, then we will be making progress. We will be moving forward.
Yeah, I love that the emotional intelligence really is about the individual and allowing them to be introspective, which a lot of people who don't have a lot of awareness or empathy are relatively happy to think about themselves, right? So it's almost like a good onboarding for folks to be able to start to build a little bit of that awareness, through understanding their own emotions and their own behaviors. We do a lot of that within our harassment prevention trainings and unconscious bias trainings of just raising awareness and empathy. And then that often very naturally helps to nudge some behavior changes. I know in LinkedIn's Global Talent Trends for 2020, they said that empathy will be the key theme going forward. So they had other themes around what they saw trending in global talent, but that empathy really connected all of them. Some of the research that we wanted to share today it's from the Center for Talent Innovation, and the research is called Being Black in Corporate America. And some of the research has shown that Black colleagues are more ambitious than their white colleagues by, it was 5 or 10%. But the Black professionals see barriers to advancement that their white colleagues, it's largely invisible to their white colleagues. So you've got a lot of ambition across Black professionals. You've got a lot of people who are going to work and doing their very best work and hitting, roadblocks over and over again, whether that's experiencing racial prejudice at work or experiencing microaggressions. And, we've talked a little bit about the microaggressions, like somebody wanting to touch natural hair and M-Train actually has a video on this available on YouTube. Being told that you're articulate, as if you wouldn't be as a well-read, well-educated person. Other people taking credit for your ideas, which we know happens not just within the Black community, but particularly for women. Being mischaracterized as angry. So when you are forthright and making your point or defending a position that you might have, people kind of taking that little code word of being angry because you're seen as an angry Black person, which is a stereotype, a really problematic stereotype. And then little invalidations, like white people who often are trying to be well-meaning will say, well, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. When in fact they're discounting a lot of environment and sort of the way that the Black people are treated by not seeing color. We have even more microaggressions, of course, now that we're home. And so you had brought up a couple that you'd recently heard of and experienced. Do you want to share some of those?
One of the comments I heard about home is, oh, you have a lovely house. And this person was on a webinar, and that comment was said 3 or 4 times. And this was a Black person, and what was the implication of continuing to repeat, you have a lovely home? But Laraine, you made me laugh when you said the natural hair, because yes, the shelter in place has had some of us go to our natural hair. And no, I don't know if I'll let you touch it, but I might because we're friends. But no, but that is one that's there. Oh, that's your hair. Can I touch it? It's so soft. And we don't normally go around touching people's hair, but perhaps that one will go away because of the virus and distancing. So that's one thing. But the other thing too is the distancing. When you're already feeling alone and isolated, to have the distancing, it compounds that. So again, leaders can just ask their employees, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Making sure that they're brought into the conversation when they're on webinars, or encouraging them, giving them the company mantra to say that day, or allowing them to report on something. Again, being sensitive to everyone doesn't have the same space in their homes to work from offices, so there'll be different sizes, they'll look differently. So being mindful of judgments that employees may make around that, or management may make around that. Children, how many children are there, how many are present or running in. It's a really challenging time for parents with young children at home. So looking at all those differences and understanding that they are differences, but they should not have a great bearing on the performance or the evaluation of performance or opportunities for advancement.
Yeah, you talked about promotability for somebody who doesn't have a lovely home and isn't in an ideal working situation.
Right.
Some of those sort of subconscious impressions of that person and their level of success or their promotability could really subconsciously affect their opportunities in the future.
And they're stressed. They're stressed about it, because if you think about it, people have had to invite people into their homes when they weren't prepared first, and second, that they have never done that before. So this is really a challenging and stressful time for us all. And again, I continue to emphasize, because it's so important, because that's another microaggression. As soon as a Black will mention something that affects Blacks in a different way, another person will come and say, well, I've had this experience, or I've had that experience. And that negates the Black's experience. That negates the person's experience. We shouldn't do that to anyone. But in particular, it happens with Blacks all of the time, where people will make a comparison of their situation to a Black person's situation. And there is nothing like the situation that Blacks experience in America, just because of the history.
Absolutely.
But not to dwell on that piece, but to talk about some of those numbers. You mentioned the statistics, and Ibram Kendi has written a book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he has founded an organization, and they are actually tracking the COVID statistics, because the nation wasn't tracking the statistics in terms of race. And you mentioned that. And states like Alabama, where Blacks are 26% of the population, they're 44% of the cases and 46% of the deaths. If you look at the District of Columbia, where Blacks are 46% of the population, they're 54% of the positive cases and 78% of the deaths. And then if you go over to Philadelphia, where Blacks are 12% of the population, 30% of the cases, and 21% of the deaths. So again, the Blacks have the highest numbers in deaths. They're beginning to track the numbers in Latinas and Asians and Native Americans and to have those statistics. And we will have, I think, you'll be sharing some resources, and we'll have the link to this site where people can actually track and see how Corona is affecting Blacks. But also, they can see from the information you had from the Center of the CTI is what I call it. Those statistics, which we'll share that link too, if you look at that, Blacks professionals have said they've experienced racial prejudice at work. And if you look at it by region, the West is 66%, the Midwest 79%, South 56%, and the North 44%, the Northeast. And I make that point to say, I'm from the South. I am from Memphis, Tennessee. I was a very young child to the garbage strikes, the strikes that led to the death of Martin Luther King. And I hear all of the time that the South is the place of racism. The South is the place, it's the worst place to be. And when you see things that happen, like that happened to Ahmaud, you would say yes. But the point about Blacks have experienced racial prejudice in every region of this country. It is a national crisis. It's a national issue. It's not just a South issue. And so I wanted to make that point that all companies, all businesses can contribute and do their part in helping with this discussion and helping with employees, again, dealing with the emotional aspects around the subject of race and helping have that positive dialogue that will impact everyone, because everyone is impacted by racism. And when we think it's always a positive way, it's a negative way, because statistics have shown also that diversity lends to greater financial rewards for all businesses. So everyone can, when businesses, of course, we know that is the bottom line for them, and we respect that. And so by us all being able to work together, more effectively, have more input into solutions, which will create better and greater outcomes, it's important that we take this opportunity where it's really amplified the inequities in our country, that businesses step up and help with this issue, just as they do with sustainability and global warming.
Yeah.
Make this a priority as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just, I think everybody understands, even if they have very low EQ, that emotions are higher for all right now. And so recommending a training or suggesting to, certain leaders in your organization or more broadly across your organization, that now is a good time for this emotional intelligence training, I think makes a ton of sense. I think that we are both worried about the fact that, Black professionals often have to work harder at work, especially for opportunities to network, opportunities for visibility, opportunities for opportunities, right? The chance to do bigger projects, more impactful projects, to get bigger assignments. Mm-hmm. And so now with everybody working from home on videos, it's just maybe even harder to be heard. So any thoughts there for what folks can do, to make sure that they, continue some momentum that they may have built around getting mentors or networking, et cetera?
One of the things that they can do is to volunteer for projects, to step up and raise your hand and say, I know that's something that I can do. And even now, if you were reticent about doing it when you were on site in your workplace, now is the time to get that visibility, because everybody's watching, because everybody's on these big webinars. We're hearing more and more of those every day. So volunteer. Talk with your manager about, I'm ready to take on additional responsibilities. What can I do from home to help the team, to help the manager reach their objectives, to help the company reach their objectives? Also, networking. LinkedIn is a great place to network. Finding those in your company who you may not even be connected with on LinkedIn, but you remember, I was on this team with them. Connect with them. Stay in touch with them. Reach out. And you'll be amazed. People will reach back out to you. I've made so many connections just from doing just that, looking at people that I've worked with or that I've met in meetings and saying, hey, I remembered that we met at this place. I'd love to link with you. And those are opportunities. And then as you're linking, ask a business question. Ask a question and of course, preface it with, how are they doing? Because again, emotions have no respect of persons. We all have emotions. And while their trauma or their crisis may not be the same as yours, they could be experiencing something at their home that is just devastating to them. And once you've made that friend, built that trust, then that can go a long way, particularly if you're going back to the office. Or, and I'll share this story, I worked from home for almost 12 years for IBM. IBM was ahead of the curve in working from home, I think, and allowing people. And I was able to do that. I was able to reach out. I was able to network. I was able to get promotions, change positions, travel. And that worked very, very well. But it took action on my part, and I did step up for projects. And so I highly encourage that now. And again, even when you're feeling that isolated feeling, that's the perfect time. Find somebody to reach out to within your company, make a new friend.
I love it. It's great advice. You also have a call to action for us. Will you share that now?
Yes. My call to action for businesses, business executives, managers, leaders of teams, make the space for the discussion of race. It is real. It is not negative. Now is a time when we can approach it from a non-hostile way. If, again, we allow ourselves to take some emotional intelligence, literacy, and become more in tune with ourselves, and then have that discussion. And for the executives and the businesses, design the plans for solutions and clearly state the consequences and measure and reward change. Because what gets measured and what gets rewarded, gets done. And that's been proven time and time again in business. What gets measured, what gets rewarded, gets done. So our diversity and inclusion plans and all of the action plans we're doing, if they don't have a quantifiable measurement and some celebration, some reward at the end, then chances are as many people as we would like would not be a part of the solution and the discussion. For us as Black people, we want to take responsibility for our own emotional safety. If your company is offering emotional intelligence training, take it. If you have an opportunity to sit on a webinar, do that. If you have an opportunity, and companies, again, are doing assessments, and they have neuroscience-based assessments and evidence-based assessments, take one of those. A lot of times there are emotional intelligence assessments that are just questionnaires. They don't give you as reliable or as in-depth data and responses as you like, and they don't remove that judgment when we talk about calling things up without calling things out. So for your emotional intelligence, I highly recommend taking assessments. Also in the training, and when I do training, I allow people to write their story. Everyone write their story, because even the person whose story you disagree with, we must own and recognize their story, and it's as real to them as ours is as real to us. So once we start listening, because along with emotion, empathy that Laraine mentioned earlier, it builds trust. And trust is the foundation for any relationship, any team meeting, any team collaboration, any results. So that's important there. And then finally, it's not an either or solution. This is complicated, it's deep, it's emotional, it's sad, it'll bring up grief. So all of those things, all of the policies that have been put in place, those things take time to unwind. So we need to be working together. We'll need to work on ourselves, and we'll need to be patient. But I'm confident that there can be huge strides and changes that will come out of this time, just because of the heightened sense of awareness that emotions are important and they are not separated from home and work and friends, that they're with us all the time. And executives are now recognizing that and paying attention to that. So that's the call of action, Laraine, to recognize, call it what it is, it's racism, and let's help to develop some remedies.
Thank you so much, Janet, for joining us today. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. You can follow M-Train on LinkedIn and see additional Always Learning broadcasts like this one. But, you know, Janet, I really want to thank you for the partnership, for the collaboration, and for the friendship. I really appreciate you joining us here today.
The same here. Thank you so much. And again, thanks to M-Train for allowing us to have this discussion, for making the space to have this discussion. We have them all the time. And if more people would have those discussions and using their emotional agility and maturity, I think, again, we can make some great strides. So thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
All right.